And thanks for joining us here at Multiverse and tuning in to the Rise of Solarpunk and Hope panel on the Science Fiction Geek track. I'm Jim Nettles, science fiction and fantasy author. I also write nonfiction, futurist work as well. I'm the founder for Author Essentials, Author Services, and Author Education Company, and I am one of the founders for the Continual Convention. Before we get started, please consider supporting this year's charity, the Equal Justice Initiative, which can be found at eji.org. And you can make donations by going to ko-fi.com/multiversecon. Also consider swinging by multiversecon.org, where you can find out all about this year's programming, pick up some swag, and support the convention in the process. Also, join us over on the Multiverse Discord server by going to multiverse.org/Discord. So before we get started, I'm going to have my other panelists introduce themselves. I'm going to start with Melissa.
Hi, I'm Melissa McArthur. I'm the Associate Publisher at Falstaff Books. I'm also an author, editor, graphic designer, and work with Authors Essentials.
And Kay.
Hi, I am an editor, some occasional writer, and have worked with, just recently, for 5 years, I worked with Escape Pod as a slush reader, associate editor in some places, worked on a couple of special issues, and I also do narration for them.
And Robert.
Hi, my name is Robert Jeffrey. I'm a comic book writer, a graduate of the 2017 DC Comics New Writers Workshop, and the writer of Route 3, Mind to Avenge, and prose and fiction and wherever I can get in.
So we're here to talk about Solarpunk. We all know, we all kind of love the good, fun, apocalyptic, dystopian, the world's going to end stories. And of course, right now it feels like we might be living in one. But, we've got 1984, Fahrenheit 451, Divergent, Mad Max, all these kinds of things. But what about we are looking at stories with hope for the future? I mean, the first things that really got me into it were looking at things like Star Trek and whatnot that had hope. But Solarpunk is one of those things that came out inspired out of the steampunk movement, looking at realistic ideas that create hope and hopeful stories going forward. So in that light and in that vein, we're here to kind of talk about the movement. We're here to talk about what it's for, writing in the genre, all that kind of good stuff. So starting there, what kind of elements in Solarpunk do you really consider core to the genre? What story brought you interest in the genre? For example, for me, one of the first ones I really remember reading was Ursula K. Guin and the Dispossessed. And it was one I read in the early 80s. And, this is before I really even knew what that term would have meant. But as a kid, I remember reading that story and the conflict in it, but it coming out with that sense of hope. So what about you guys? Robert.
For me, sometimes it's kind of difficult to find examples of Solarpunk because it seems like we're like inundated with the negative and, the horrible future. And, we're going to be running from zombies or cannibals or some combination of the two. I think that's the same anyways. But, for me, it's always, when I can find an example, it always comes back to Star Trek, like the blueprint behind me. When Roddenberry created, the franchise, there was a sense of we have to get past, the trials and tribulations that they were dealing with back in the late 60s, early 70s. So there's a lot of, even with the conflict that's involved with different alien races and humans and, whatever throughout the original series, I found that, Star Trek is a big example of Solarpunk for me, as far as, where humans can get to, I guess the good place. So, but that's a standout example for me.
So, Kay, what about you?
I also read The Dispossessed early and very much enjoyed it, and it was something entirely different from anything I had ever read. I was a young teen at the time, but there's also another I think that should be a classic, and I also think should qualify as solarpunk or hope punk. And it was the last novel that Aldous Huxley wrote, called Island.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, you know, he goes to the island, which has been very cut off if you haven't read it, and learns from them these things that are very much in the vein of solarpunk, and how to create a new society and to bring things that he took from the island back into the real world. But I've also been reading, both back when I was slushing for Escape Pod and just in my own particular let me grab a book, I've been reading a lot of this because it's just it's an antidote to despair in some cases. And having lived experience with living under or living with solar power as your only source, it's good to read that kind of stuff and see how much things have changed and how much things haven't changed, and what it will be like in the future.
Melissa?
I think probably my first exposure to it was as a kid growing up watching Captain Planet, because it was something that was hopeful, and it was something that everybody could do and participate in, and if we all worked together, you know, things would be okay. More recently, I was thinking about the City of Ember. I don't know if it really classifies as solar punk or not, but it does. It's if you haven't read it, it's basically this underground city that's about 250 years old, that was built and created as to give people a place to go after nuclear war. And the whole story for the first book is about them getting out of the city because it's failing, because it wasn't meant to hold them for that long. They just didn't know they were supposed to leave. And then actually going back out into nature and the real world, and that kind of thing. And I didn't mention it in my bio, but I teach college as well. And one of the things that we teach a lot of the times is Plato's The Allegory of the Cave. And that idea of coming out and coming out into the sun and, you know, a different world, something that has hope, that's out of darkness. This book kind of reminds me a little bit of that.
So in that light, I mean, a lot of this movement really seems to have started coming out of the 60s, 70s, that period when there was a lot of the dystopian movement, and we were seeing a lot of films and stories and books, you know, going back to Aldous Huxley and Brave New World and these sorts of things. You had the significant balance coming out of that period where it was everything starts with some sort of an apocalypse, some sort of really major world ender. And it almost seems to me, if we look at something like even Planet of the Apes, you could treat that in a way as solar punk, just not necessarily favorable for the humans, but it was, you know, the world had come back and there was a movement. But if you then compare that to so many of the other films and whatnot, or stories, books, we'd had to go through some sort of major challenge, some sort of major apocalypse, to then be able to progress to the next step. So is that something you think is really required in Solarpunk? Do you think that we can have a story where we move forward and almost have that step forward, that we say we almost got to that brink and we stepped back from that and we created the hopeful society? You know, what is it you think that becomes the trigger in both fiction, and then if you kind of carry that forward, what do you think we can learn from this in terms of hopefully trying to influence people in society with these stories? So, okay, you want to take a shot at that one?
Well, in the late 1970s and early 80s, we were living in an apocalypse.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how to put this exactly succinctly, but my mother married an off-the-grid survivalist guy, and in 1978, we moved to the middle of central Utah, and because we were going to get bombs dropped on us at any moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we had no electricity, we had no paved roads, we had no phone, we had water only because we illegally tapped into a county line and stole it. But we were easily 15 miles away from the nearest habitation, 4 miles from the nearest power line. So everything we had was solar. And it was, coming to that point because of this impending nuclear apocalypse brought a lot of people into that kind of space where they said, we have to go find a different way. But what I saw then, as opposed to what I see now in Solarpunk, is that back then, everyone else, everyone who was not us, was suspect. And in the Solarpunk that I am now so thoroughly enjoying, it has a much more community-based vibe. It's talking more about people who are coming together, whether it's overcoming bad politics or walking away from like the recent novel from Cory Doctorow and forming something else and something new. But that I see that change from the 1970s, it's me against the world, to now into the 2000s, it's us trying to make something better. And that's one of the biggest appeals that I see so far.
So then do you see kind of the shift there as well about we're moving from where everything is suspicious, almost that the road type of feel, which is the grim, dark, apocalyptic sort of thing, where those even in what would be considered solar punk from those days, we were already preparing for, because I grew up next to an Air Force base where SAC and TAC was headquartered.
Mm-hmm.
We were going to glow. There was just going to be one big hole. It was fine. So keep going until that happens. But if we go from those times then and compare to now, where again, if we, at any moment that could happen, but it's not as prescient, it's not as likely to happen, probably. With comparing then to now, do you think that's where we're also seeing more of the movement because the societal changes from it's us, but it's going to be our little compound that's the utopia and the rest of the world can burn, versus now that's much more of a we want to build the new world?
I agree with that. I think that it is more we want to make changes to build a world that's better for everyone. So that I see a lot more inclusive communities in solarpunk fiction. I see a lot more innovation. But on the reality timeline, when we had solar panels that were incredibly expensive on our roof, there were probably a handful of other people in the entire state who had them, who were using them in the civilian world. Now, you can't throw a rock without hitting something that doesn't have a solar panel on it. So the society has crept as that technology has moved on. And that to me is a positive thing. And I think that's something that makes the impending apocalypse of whatever a lot less likely. I think the solar punk is more intentional, and the actual real world change into using less fossil fuel is also intentional.
So what about you, Melissa? What do you think in terms of where solar punk may have been versus where we're going towards now? Those story influences, what is it for you that is inspiring here or that may pull you forward?
I think that it tends to go in waves. If I think all the way back to Brave New World, which I don't really think is solar punk.
It was kind of the precursor to it. In a way, it was the collapse of the civilization that led to it, at least in my take.
We could talk about that one later if you want to. But I think that kind of moving from that, because if I'm not mistaken, that was written and published in the 30s, to actively working with like the Manhattan Project and things like that, we have this sort of flow of, oh crap, the world is going to explode and we're going to do terrible, terrible things, to this, we have to fix everything. And then moving into, toward the 80s and 90s of overconsumption and, the increase of trash and what we're going to do, and going out and looking into space to see if there are other habitable planets. I think that it kind of goes in that we're going to reach a tipping point, and then it's like, okay, we have to do something, and then it's like, okay, well, we kind of fixed it, now we're moving back. And the thing that makes me hopeful about the rise of solarpunk being a genre or subgenre is that maybe we're at a point where all the little tipping points we've gotten to the top of that. And so even if we do have, another apocalyptic sort of situation, that we could come out on top rather than have it morph into something that's not what was intended. Because if you think about Brave New World, they intended for it to be a place where everyone was happy and everybody knew what they were supposed to do. And, there was, everything was perfect, but they weren't happy. There was a whole world outside that was the real world. And, they were terrible and mean to those people who weren't, happy enough, kind of like Stepford Wives, but societal rather than relationships. Did that make any sense?
Yeah. So following up to that, I actually think Stepford Wives is an interesting allegory of, do you have a real utopia or do you have a forced utopia in some of these stories as well, where the question is, did we take what appeared to be a good and happy society or something like that, but really it was forced, so that what you lost and traded there, was it human spirit for safety and security and whatnot. I think that's one of those interesting themes as well we see, is true happiness and return to some sort of more nature base or something like that, versus the technocratic version of solarpunk. I think that's an interesting question.
Yeah, I would almost see the Hunger Games as more hopeful than Brave New World, to be honest, because at least with that, they're saying that there's something wrong, and they want to tear that down and fix it and bring it back. Take away a lot of the over privilege and over, makeup and designed of the upper sectors. What were they called? I can't remember. And having it more like they had in 11, 12, 13. They had the different focus on like farming and baking bread and hunting and things like that were more natural and less wasteful. Whereas with Brave New World, they're hatching babies in a hatchery and training them with basically Pavlovian psychology.
Everyone will be happy. Everyone will be happy. Everyone will be happy. Take your little blue pill.
I'm a beta.
So what about you, Robert?
I tend to be a little pessimistic, and even before 2020, I using Star Trek as a reference. One of the things that I guess unfortunately impresses me is that it takes World War III for humanity to decide to get it right. And so I think that the catastrophic tragedy is always going to be a part, even of solarpunk, as far as being the I guess the catalyst that pushes whatever the protagonist to to do better or to seek out a better world. I feel that things are definitely within our world are definitely getting more inclusive, more accepting than in years past, I'm an '80s baby, and there was still sexism, homophobia, racism, transphobia, even then, and we were supposed to be enlightened then. So, fast forward to 2020, we're still dealing with the same issues. So I think that will, unfortunately, will always be a part of Solarpunk. My hope is that we we start to see a future in which um, we can get past that. But that's the pessimistic writer in me, and then also just as a human being waking up every day and just kind of watching the news. Um, but I have hope. I've actually, I think one of the supreme examples of solar punk like recently has been, for me, Wakanda, and Black Panther. That is more on the Afrofuturism side, but when you see this world, and also coming from comic books, there are comic books from the continent and also from people of color, where we see a hopeful future. But I think for the world at large, like Wakanda and the 2018 Black Panther is a very good example of that, of how we can turn a personal tragedy or actually a continental tragedy into something that's bigger and better, utilizing technology and the natural resources. But yeah, so that's my hope, as far as with the genre, that we can grow to something big and peaceful and loving.
So going back to one of the things you first said, though, looking at Star Trek, and there's arguments about whether or not that's truly a utopian universe as
Mhm,
well. But if we look at the fact that you had Zephram Cochrane,
mhm,
it took a world war that devastated the planet. It took Zephram Cochrane going and saying, wonder what happens next, and then attracting the presence of Vulcans to become the trigger for what became the Federation and what became Star Trek's universe.
right.
So from that side of things, do you think that we not only need the apocalypse, we also then need the next trigger that says, but you can do better?
Sometimes I feel that people don't get it until they get knocked upside the head, a few times, and that's unfortunate. That's very unfortunate. And so, as in Trek's case, that's what happened. You had so many millions of people who had died during, World War III, and it pushed us to do more. Um, so the thing that I love about Star Trek is that there are complexities in terms of you have this idea of like this utopian existence, um, as the closer you are to the Federation. So if you're on Earth, you live in you have replicators, you don't want for food or homes, or there's no such thing as homelessness. There's no such thing as prejudice. It's on and on and on. But the further you get out from Earth, that's where it seems to get a little bit more murky. So that's something I've noticed when it comes to Trek, at least my personal opinion, that and shows like Deep Space Nine actually pushed against this ideal of the utopian existence of the Federation, and then you've had other times in Trek where this idea of solar punk has been pushed against. So um, I I think that it does the franchise as a whole does, and especially nowadays where we are trying to bring in deeper themes of what's going on now, and also dealing with you know I guess groups that weren't included within Trek, to see if we can continue to kind of push towards that peaceful or hopeful existence. I mean, the most recent season, spoilers, is pushing towards a time where the Federation doesn't even exist.
Mm-hmm.
So has that idea of solar punk been, is it dead and gone? So, but as a Trekkie, that fascinates me. Some Trekkies, it doesn't, so they just want to ride around the cosmos with Kirk. And I'm like, we got to get beyond that. So,
Well, and I think DS9 is a good example because
yeah.
one of the storylines, I'm a huge fan of DS9.
Mhm.
One of the stories that they went with was the idea of an early solar sail
Mhm.
in one of the stories where Cisco and his son rebuilt the ship, and all the rest of that. And I think that little piece of hope
Mhm.
within all the rest of the conflict there that went backwards was an interesting callback. I think that could also be seen as almost an echo of Solarpunk after the rebirth of that civilization.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
so let's talk a little bit more about Solarpunk in terms of the tropes, the elements, the things that you think are important to see within the genre, because we're talking about giving hope, but it still has to be actionable hope. And to me, that's one of the things that's important about Solarpunk is it's not everybody's gone solar, everybody's gone this, and the world is just happy, and then you have to create the antagonist. It's pragmatic action, I think, that really defines the genre a lot of the time, is the fact, like going back to Wakanda, you see a society that has taken action, created sciences, created technology, but still has, they use that, but it's not the core of their civilization. It's not the core of what they do. As a people, they leverage that to then have the full lives that they've got going on. So if you look at the stories, the tropes, what are the elements and the things that you think are critical to make sure we're addressing? Is it climate change? Is it, creating a post-scarcity environment? Is it cleaning up oceans? Is it getting off the planet and making sure that we're not stranded and stuck to just this one world in the event of the asteroid that hits? So Melissa, I guess for you, where do you start with that in terms of Solarpunk?
I would say that it needs to have some sort of aspect of sustainability, whether it is, looking at like, a very Disney World, Epcot-like gardening system, or if it's traveling to other planets, or if it is, looking at, how the world's changing as far as like, you know, rising sea levels. There needs to be some sort of aspect of sustainability, whether that does take place actually physically on Earth or in another way. Maybe it's travel, maybe it's even sustainability as far as like cryogenic freezing, sustainability for like bodily sustainability. So that's probably the biggest thing, aside from hope.
Robert?
I would say inclusion, like true representation. Um, there's, statistically, the numbers are showing that, there will be a browning of the world. There will be, it just, because one of the things I have kind of a love-hate relationship sometimes with sci-fi is that, in the past, in the works that I grew up loving, as far as, like Jules Verne or, things along that line, it seems like we didn't exist. But I think that, going into the future, especially like something like a solar punk future, I think that true representation, of everybody needs to happen. And I think with the sci-fi that I'm seeing now, which is not necessarily solar punk, we see more of that. Something like The Expanse, something like Star Trek Discovery, or Lost in Space. So I think specifically with solar punk, whether it's prose, film, TV, or even video games, something like Mass Effect, with I have to see somebody that looks like me, or living in a city like New York City or something. That's something that I think is key and essential.
Okay.
I'm right there with sustainability. I know that a few of the stories that I have read seem to be pulling technology out of nowhere. And there is always, every bit of current and future energy technology has a downside. Wind power is great. Right here in Texas, wind power generation now is higher than coal, and that's great. But there's the issue of like the billions of birds that are getting killed by rotors. A company in Norway figured out how to fix that. You just paint one of the forgot what they're called. You paint one of the
Props.
propellers black,
Mhm.
or props. You paint one black with the others white, and the birds can actually see that. And
Mhm.
Oh,
they
that's
this
cool.
power company, it's an island that I don't know how to pronounce in Norway, that's nothing but wind power. And they did that experiment and it dropped bird deaths by 70%. And creating solar panels themselves creates all kinds of waste. How that's the challenge of new solarpunk fiction, is how to balance that, how to figure out a way of how do we create the thing that's going to get us out of this climate change problem without causing more climate change. Or if creating food is as easy as your own little matter conveyor that you can just punch buttons on and get what you want out of it. Who is creating the feedstock for that? Where is that coming from? It's sort of supply chain things. And that's how I think. And that's what I'd love to see more of, is that balance in the supply chain and the end result, and how it doesn't exacerbate the problem that we're already in.
I really think that the creativity that science fiction and fantasy creators have could really help solve some of the problems if we are at the actual real world problems through something like that.
I agree. I think that a lot of speculative fiction preceded technological advances. So.
Well, and I think that's one of the things that's important is, as fiction writers, we have an opportunity to explore both the good and the bad. So we can look at the technological advances, look at what that can bring to a society, look at what that can do. But then we also have to look at the other side of it. We have to still have conflict in the story. We still have to have the other side of that. So if we're looking and having a setup, sometimes that antagonist is still nature, because nature is still coming and saying, that's cute, glad, nice try. I'm still going to come back with the global hurricane. I'm still going to come back with new ice ages. Or other times it's going to be, somebody comes and says, oh, love what you've done with a place. You're now a soft target. We're going to come and invade your utopia. So I think that's one of the things we have to look at is the antagonists that we're dealing with and how they show the weaknesses or the challenges or the things that have to be looked at and dealt with in terms of whatever has now created that new society. So what do you think in terms of balancing all the hope and making sure that the antagonists emphasize that and give the reason for the hope and give that challenge that can be overcome without devastating the rest of the utopia? Because I think one of the things that does get underplayed sometimes is, if you truly have a society that has solved their problems, they've got everything going along, yeah, you still have problems, but generally it works. And then somebody comes in. When you're recovering from that, I think this is one of the things I don't see as often in Solarpunk, is the true aftermath and how that society fully changes. So what do you think in terms of that? Robert?
And the funny thing is, before coming on this panel, I was thinking about, like, who's the bad guy in Solarpunk? It just, if everything's perfect, why, what type of conflict should there be? I mean, is there going to be? Um, I, this is a difficult one. This is kind of a difficult one for me. Um, it's, one of the, like I said, I keep going back to, Star Trek. And in the case of that, it's, the, I guess, like, the outsiders. It's just like the further you get from Earth, there are those alien species that, they come into conflict with, and the precious ideals of the Federation are, you know, um, once again pushed against, and something closer to home. Um, using Black Panther as the example, it's it's a quote unquote outsider, coming into Wakanda and messing with the framework of what's been around for hundreds of years. So maybe it has to be like an outsider who comes in, to test to basically test to see if this is truly the utopia that these people are claiming that it can be. That's 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 kind of what comes up for me. It's just the the outsider. So
I think in addition to the outsider, one inherent conflict is who gets to define the utopia? Who defines what that actually is? And at what point does it cross into satire? Because if I think about like Thomas More's utopia, that's a totally different kind of thing, and it's not helpful. It's if you limit to one person's ideal utopia, what does that do to the other people? And I think that that's one conflict that just about all of them, I think, have to deal with in a way, is defining, who gets to choose the definition of what is good.
So what do you think, Kay?
Well, some of the books that I have read that really made a big difference to me early on, I know that this may not, it's pretty close to Solarpunk, but it was a novel called The Fifth Sacred Thing. And that was basically a bunch of women started a takeover in San Francisco and then turned the San Francisco area into a utopia post-apocalypse. And of course, there was the outsider that was a threat. But also, there was this sense of, I'm looking for the word, I hate it when that happens, that they met the violence coming in with this kind of overwhelming acceptance of, you're gonna shoot that person right over there because you're angry. Well, then I'm gonna take their place. And then I'm going to take that other person's place. I'm going to take that other person's place. And it was sort of a fatalistic thing, but it worked in the end. Spoilers, it's a really old novel. I think one of the biggest challenges that we're going to face, both in reality and definitely in stories, is the people versus the planet. People versus climate change itself. People versus the PVE. People versus environment. Yes, I'm a gamer. But just the struggle to survive at some point in the future or near future, or even longer than that, I think that's the environment itself is going to become an antagonist.
Well, I'm going to throw one out. I'm going to actually throw a film out here that everybody's going to laugh at a little bit, because obviously it is satire. Demolition Man.
Okay.
So
I was just thinking that when satire came up, I thought about Demolition Man and the toilets. Anyways, I'm sorry.
Well, no, I mean, again, it's one of those things I think becomes an interesting question, is from whose viewpoint is it a utopia? Because one of the things that we commonly see presented as, to create a utopia, everyone has to be fully like-minded. But the opposite side of that becomes stagnation of creativity, stagnation of development, stagnation of innovation. And this is one of the other challenges I've had sometimes with some of the Solarpunk stories and some of the more hopeful things I've read, much like going back to the one you were just talking about, is sometimes what gets presented is not entirely realistic within human nature. Or it's the question of, like anything else, if you tell Star Wars from the perspective of the Emperor, he's trying to create a utopia. So is that also one of the things that we're looking at as a challenge in terms of telling good Solarpunk, is creation of the utopia that they're at least working towards or have created, and defining how that means the society versus the individual. Okay, you want to take a shot at that one?
What's the question?
I'm gonna have to come back
Well,
to
so if we look at it, the environments that we create in Solarpunk, the ones we define as being the utopia, I think that's one of those questions of one of the first things that always comes to mind is how large of a culture can we create and still have that single-minded utopia? It's one thing if it's a village of a couple of hundred, a couple of thousand. It's another thing if you have a city of millions. So that's why I go to Demolition Man. You see what up front looks to be this grand utopia where no one offends anyone and no one does anything. And the worst offense of all is that they made Taco Bell the ultimate winner of the restaurant, the restaurant wars. Looking at something like that, but you then have to see what it takes to hold a civilization that large together without it falling apart. And I wonder if sometimes we don't get to see that part as well, is what it takes to make that civilization truly work in terms of shifting people and the culture. And I think that sometimes we see the world building says, here is the culture, but we don't necessarily see what it took to get there.
So there's a series it's a series of two anthologies, and I contributed to the second one, which is called Dark Universe. And the basic gist of it is um, it's in kind of an Afro-futuristic take on let's say Star Wars, the space opera. And when that universe begins at its kind of outset, it's for this this grand kind of reason of getting away from Earth, which is not hospitable to people of color. And just so there's a corporation which is run by, and I'm forgetting names right now, but let's say I want to say Black Bill Gates, but he's able to build kind of like an ark situation, and they find a hospitable planet, and the world there, that empire grows from there. So it grows from these very like altruistic, benevolent reasons, but at a certain point it becomes too big for its own good or whatever, too large for its own good. So that's where kind of the conflict involved comes in. And it was fun contributing to the world, but you know at their at the beginning, I think the solar punk ideals were what they were shooting for. And, you know, as with anything, conflict comes into play. So that's, I think that's kind of along the lines of what you're asking about. But the cool thing about this series is that you are able to see, the dismantling of this empire from a variety of perspectives from people of color, just showing that, even then we're not monolithic. There's we're fighting wars in space. So it's definitely one I think should be checked out, in terms of a bright future turning it into something else. So that maybe that's kind of counter to what we're discussing, but that's like the first thing that kind of came to mind.
Okay, Melissa, one of you guys want to take a shot at it?
Well, just from, I've lived in many places in the United States and different places and within completely different cultures that were completely alien to me, even though they were Americans. And I find utopias very hard to believe in, just in general. That really there is always dissent. There is always someone who wants to change something else. And there are so many ways of doing that. There are so many political systems that are set up to help people live with each other despite whatever. So I am not sold on the ultimate utopia. And I think even an ultimate utopia couldn't really exist. There will always be conflict and there will always be dissenters. And so holding up change and societies as a future utopia, it just doesn't work for me. I think you can get close to, it's what's that mathematical It's you are
Limits.
approaching X. It's your limits. You're approaching, but you'll never get there.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, because I think a true utopia would actually be utter hopelessness, because there would be nothing to look toward. It, you know, it would become so complacent and so mundane that it wouldn't be utopian anymore. It would be, you know, there's nothing better. One of the theories of with positive psychology and, you know, studying like happiness and things like that is that, you know, if there's no place for pleasant surprises, then there's increased unhappiness. So I think that kind of what you were saying, Kay, about that, you know, not utopia not being realistic. It's absolutely right. It's it seems like it would be just utter hopelessness.
Well, and I think this is kind of really where I was going with the question is utopia really possible? Because I don't think it is. I think utopia is a matter of being a point in time. It's like anything else. Is it, you know, there, you know, happy forever, happy for now? It's where you stop the story, or is it the start of the next cycle of conflict? And that's, I think, a lot of the time how we pick within story what we want to tell. You know, is it the creation of the utopia coming out of a conflict, or is it a conflict that takes a utopia to change, to create the next change? Because again, I'm a firm believer that creativity and innovation comes out of need and conflict. And I think in a true utopia, you lose that surge. So from your perspective, then, does that mean that to make realistic and pragmatic solarpunk stories, because that's kind of some of the tropes here, is something that's doable and actionable, part of what we need to show is still the conflict within the society and how that gets resolved?
I think it's sort of like the other punk genres. You know, with steampunk, it's not necessarily, well, this is how we make steam. You know, this is how we make this device. There's still a story, and there's still character driven, and, you know, they're people stories most of the time rather than technology stories. And I think that Solarpunk falls into that same kind of thing, that it's about sort of a, you know, a similar type of technological shift, but it's, you know, still a character driven story at the heart of it.
Yeah, for me, people are always going to come first, no matter what the genre is. You know, as much as I love Trek, and the techno babble can get boring. It's what the what the characters are doing with the techno babble, or with any space opera sci-fi that I love. That's always going to be the heart of it. For me as a reader and as a writer. So how the characters exist within a solarpunk world is going to be key to me, as both a fan and as a creator. So
in the stories that I like, the stories that I like to write are all very character based, and it's about the working between people and how relationships form and fail or not, and interpersonal conflict, whether it's from two different people or from two different cities. But on the same hand, I love to have all that in there, but I also want to make sure that when I'm adding in the technological things, like the story that I've been working on for way longer than I should have, and I need to finish it sometime, the main character has solar farm equipment that they call the solar mule that does a lot of the farm work because there are not enough people to do it. So getting into talking about that kind of technology is fun to do in the story, but it's not the whole main point of it. But I think it's important to try to give nudges into the, hey, what can happen next? What's based on modern technology? What would the writer see that becoming in 50 years?
So let's kind of go back towards the hopeful, because, of course, this is all about hope.
Yeah.
So do you think that Solarpunk can also not necessarily be as much about the big futuristic cities and the major things? What about stories that are really much more about returning to nature, finding ways to work much more in harmony with it? It doesn't have to be the big spaceships, the replicators, and everything else. Some of it can be a return back to older ways, older practices, but maybe leveraging new tools and technologies to make it easier, like the solar plow. So, is that something you want to see in your stories? Is that something that actually gives you hope, that feeling of not being trapped by the technology, but something that lets you see a world where things do become simpler again?
Yeah, the story that I'm writing is basically that. It's rural. I set a lot of my stories in rural places because I grew up in rural places and know them well. And yeah, that getting into a simpler way, methods of farming that have been used for thousands of years. Why aren't we still using them? And can we get a machine to do that for us that's not going to ruin the world? So yeah, totally into that.
Yeah, I think that's great too. And one thing that I worry about, trying to create stories like this is over romanticizing the past. Because, and that's where that technology, like you were talking about with the mule, that we can take things that were problematic and we can use new innovation to make them not as problematic anymore. And we still do end up with other problems, but we can, it doesn't have to be, oh, the good old days were just the good old days. And we can really actually address the things that we're looking over with the kind of rose colored glasses.
Anything, Robert?
It's this is kind of weird because I'm jumping genres. There's an animated series which I felt kind of melded, kind of the natural aspect with, at least at that point in their time period, which is more of a steampunk period, was I think it's the second or third season of The Legend of Korra. And she pretty much opens a bridge between, the more natural based spirit world and within the heart of Republic City, which is the epitome of technological advancement for, their, you know, um, like 20s and 30s kind of set, world. So I think that it can be done. And actually, it's we're with a comic book that I'm working on now. Um, we're throwing that aspect, the more nature-based aspect of Solarpunk, into a series that we're writing. A series that I'm writing for a publisher right now. You'll set a large part of it is in Brazil. So that's telling stories of living off the land and how that combines or I guess mashes up with the technological advancements that we're at the point at which we're at in the story. So that's been something that's been new to me, because Solarpunk is fairly new to me. So it's strange that I get the opportunity to speak on this, and I'm literally writing a series where we tap into that. But yeah, nature is I think is kind of huge when it comes to Solarpunk as a genre. So, and Legend of Korra kicks butt. So I would just recommend watching that for just that alone.
Well,
I
we're
was
coming up.
watching.
Oh,
Oh, go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Sorry.
Nope, go ahead.
I was watching The Magicians the other day. It's in I don't know, season 3 or something. But they have boats that are made of living trees, and the boats themselves have they're sentient, and they can have will and desire, and it's I don't know. It just seemed strange, but at the same time, it seemed really hopeful. Because if we think about all the things like, deforestation and all that's so dystopian, so much, if we could take it and make something that's positive out of it, that, might not be a bad thing.
Well, we're coming up on time, but again, to me, this panel has been about hope, and I know we've talked about good and bad here, but 2020 has been a challenging year for everybody. But one of the last things I want to come out of this is everybody to give that one little 1 minute flash of hope, so that everybody that's watching this has something to hold on to. For me, it's seeing, knowing that after every period of challenge like what we're going through right now, there's always some great things that come out of that and creation of new possibilities of future. So for you guys, what are you really hoping that we can see come out of these times? Robert?
Yeah, I'm sitting here thinking because I want a lot. um, um, just a better understanding that we all exist, in this world, um, and that has to matter. That and yeah, one's person existence is not less than the other. And I think when people looking at it from that most basic of levels, I think we would be chill. So but there's so much complexity. I mean, there's a lot of stuff, but I think that's so I'm hopeful that you know that's what I would want to shoot for, and watch more Star Trek. That's that's what I always tell people to do. So
Okay.
I really want to see more technology innovations in my near future. Um, I want to see more houses with solar panels on the roof. I want to see more electric cars that actually run. We have one, we love it. I want to see more electric cars on the road. I want to see more electric chargers out in the world so that those can be charged. Um, and I want to see more of that. What is the word I'm looking for that prosaic American innovation guided more toward a future that we're not, that our coastlines aren't 10 feet underwater, because we can do stuff like that. And we've done it before. I say we as in the people of North America. But it's got to happen fast, because I keep looking at predictions and wondering, well, if I move to that place, is it still going to be viable in 20 years? So I want to see that hope for solutions that are, yes, technological on one hand and also sociological on the other. I think that's very important to come up quickly, say in the next 20, 30 years.
Melissa?
I hope that we come out of this with people, society realizing that humans are more than just their productivity. That it's okay to rest. It's okay to take time to do fun things like read a book or watch Star Trek, or put together a puzzle, or just stand outside and watch the stars. So many people have gone to working from home over the past 6 months or so, and it's really truly amazing how much of a shift in the workforce there's been just in the past few months of, wow, people actually can get things done at home, and still be able to produce what they need to produce, even though even if it's not working your regular clock in at 9 o'clock, clock out at 5.
Well, guys, I want to thank you a whole lot for coming in for this hour. It's been a fun conversation. I know we got some deep stuff in there as well. And so check everybody on the panel out. And if you enjoy the panel, be sure to check out Multiverse's other programming this weekend. The full schedule's on multiversecon.org. The Discord servers out there at multiversediscon.org/Discord. I've been Jim Nettles. You can find me at jamespnettles.com. Robert, where can we find you?
Yeah, you can find me at Robert K as in Keith, JEFFREY.com. That's RobertKJeffrey.com. And all of my social media handles are there, and plenty of books for purchasing. So,
Okay.
You can find me mostly on Twitter at Nashchick, which is spelled GNASHCHICK. Or you can visit my website for editing, which is typofairy.com.
I like that.
And Melissa?
You can find me at, probably the best place is falstaffbooks.com. I think you can get to all the other relevant places through there.
Thanks, everybody, and enjoy your convention.